He wasn't meant to lead. A battered soldier, shattered in body and mind, left behind in a forgotten ward. 3 former war dogs, discarded, restless, unwanted, assigned to him like broken tools. But one of them, a German shepherd with eyes that held centuries of loyalty, refused to believe Jacob Hayes was done. He stood by his bed. He waited by the door. He led the others, not with force, but with faith. This isn't just a story about recovery. It's about redemption. About a bond forged not in comfort, but in fire. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below, and if you believe God still works miracles through fur, scars, and second chances, hit subscribe, comment amen. If you believe the broken still deserve a pack to lead. Riverside Haven was not the kind of town where seasons change gently. It was late October, and autumn didn't whisper its arrival. It crashed in with biting wind and a sky-stained pewter. The trees that lined the hills around the VA Rehabilitation Center had already shed half their leaves, carpeting the ground in muted orange and brown. A fine mist hovered in the air. Not quite rain, but enough to blur the edges of the world. The chill crept through the glass windows of the recovery ward and clung to the sterile white walls. Room 12B, tucked in the eastern wing of the facility, held more silence than any one room should. Inside, lying motionless in a mechanically adjustable hospital bed, was Jacob Hayes, 42 years old, former Master Sergeant in the U.S. Army, twice deployed in Iraq, twice sent home not entirely whole. He was tall, 6'1", with a wiry frame that had once radiated authority, but now seemed buried beneath hospital blankets and gauze wraps. His skin was pale, his jawline obscured by a few days' growth of patchy beard, and a scar trailed from his left temple down to his cheekbone, a souvenir from an IED that had taken more than just his memory. His body was slow, stiff, hesitant to respond, but his eyes, when they opened, still held embers of the man he'd once been. The door clicked open, and in trotted 3 dogs, Max, Bruno, and Shadow. They did not bark. They did not run. They entered like soldiers stepping onto sacred ground, every movement deliberate. Max led the trio. A German shepherd nearing 9 years old, he moved with a quiet confidence, the kind only earned by years of danger and duty. His sable coat had dulled slightly with age, but his eyes burned with something fierce. Sharp intelligence mixed with unwavering loyalty. A small tear in his left ear spoke of past violence, but Max carried it like a badge, not a wound. He paused at the foot of the bed and looked up at Jacob without making a sound. Behind him was Bruno, a Rottweiler built like a freight truck, powerful and grounded. His coat was jet black with warm mahogany markings, and though his size could intimidate, his demeanor was gentler than most children. He lumbered toward the armchair in the corner and curled into a ball, resting his chin on the cushion, as if guarding without being asked. Shadow was the last to enter. A sleek, dark gray Doberman, barely 5 years old, he had a nervous edge to his gait. His eyes darted to the corners of the room, always scanning, always alert. Shadow had once been partnered with a younger Marine who didn't make it home. Since then, Shadow had never rested easily, and even now, he lingered by the door, as if expecting ghosts. The dogs were not pets. They were therapy-trained former K9s, retired from combat after years of active service, now reassigned to the Wounded Warrior Canine Companion Program. It wasn't their first time meeting Jacob, but today would be different. Today, something would begin. Sarah Milton, a physical therapist in her mid-40s with a soft southern drawl and steady hands, entered next. She was average height, thin, but wiry, with light auburn hair pulled back in a bun. A car accident in her 20s had left her with a permanent limp and a deep empathy for those whose bodies no longer obeyed. She smiled faintly at the dogs, her favorite part of the job. "They came early today," she whispered, placing a folded blanket on the shelf by the window. Max walked past her without a glance and placed his front paws gently on the edge of Jacob's bed. The frame creaked slightly. Max's eyes never left the man's face. Jacob didn't stir. His eyes were half-lidded, drifting, somewhere far from the present. But Max stayed still, barely breathing, his chin hovering inches from Jacob's wrist. Then, footsteps. Heels clicked sharply against the linoleum hallway. The door swung open wider. In stepped Lauren Hayes, Jacob's wife, or at least she had once been. Lauren was tall, poised and visibly exhausted despite her flawless presentation. She wore a gray blazer over a cream blouse, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. Her makeup was impeccable, but the shadows under her eyes betrayed a woman who hadn't slept well in weeks or years. She was 39, once soft-spoken and warm, but life had pulled her taut. Raising a daughter mostly alone during Jacob's deployments, watching her husband return less and less himself each time, these things hardened her. She stood stiffly in the doorway. Her eyes flicked to the dogs, then to Sarah, then back to her husband, whom she hadn't seen in weeks. "I won't be long," she said flatly. Sarah gave a slight nod and left the room, softly closing the door behind her. The dog stayed. Lauren stepped forward, heels echoing. She didn't look at Max, even as he let out a low breath. She stopped by Jacob's side, gazing down as if seeing a stranger. "I came to say I'm leaving, Jacob." Her voice was firm, but cracks ran beneath the surface. "I've spent too long living for a man who doesn't even know my name some days. I filed the papers. You'll get them soon." No reaction. She inhaled, eyes shimmering with something unspoken. Regret or relief, it wasn't clear. "I'm not doing this out of anger. I just can't keep holding a leash that drags me into the past." She turned. That's when Max moved. Silently, he stepped forward, placing his head on Jacob's chest. His ears remained forward, not aggressive, protective, watching. Lauren hesitated at the door, hand resting on the frame. "He's in good hands," she said, more to herself than anyone else. She left. The door clicked shut. Silence returned. Max didn't move. He lay still, head rising and falling gently with Jacob's chest. Bruno opened one eye from the corner, then closed it again. Shadow shifted his weight and sat beside the door, tail brushing the floor in slow arcs. A moment passed. Jacob's hand twitched. Max's ear perked. The hand twitched again, this time brushing weakly against Max's scruff. Then, barely a squeeze, just enough to mean, "I know you're here." Max didn't lift his head. He didn't bark. But his tail gave a single slow wag. The leader had chosen to stay. The next morning arrived with the scent of wet pavement and the distant groan of construction machinery echoing through the mist-shrouded valley of Riverside Haven. A drizzle clung to the windows like condensation from a fever, softening the sunlight into a watery blur. Inside the VA Rehabilitation Center, the rhythms of healing resumed with a quiet dignity. Footsteps of nurses, clinking carts, muted voices through half-closed doors. But in room 12B, something subtle had shifted. The silence from yesterday had been replaced by breath, measured, slow, alive. Max was the first to move. As the room lightened, he rose from the floor beside Jacob's bed, stretched his legs in practiced silence, and stepped forward until his front paws rested against the mattress. His eyes scanned Jacob's face, not searching for wounds, but for signs of return. Jacob's chest rose steadily, and his left hand remained lightly curled, where it had fallen last night after clutching Max's scruff. Bruno yawned from the armchair, his jowls quivering like ripples in a pond, then stood and padded over to the base of the bed. He nudged a small blue therapy ball with his nose, rolling it gently toward Jacob's limp fingers. Shadow, already awake, had been pacing near the window, ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. He stopped when the door handle jiggled softly. The door swung open to reveal Olivia Monroe. Olivia was in her early 50s, of medium height with a frame neither fragile nor imposing. Her black hair, streaked faintly with silver, was pinned in a loose French twist, and her uniform was impeccably clean, always pressed, always neat. Her eyes were deep brown, but not soft. They carried a kind of unflinching steadiness, like someone who had stared into too many rooms where breath had faded to stillness. A former Army nurse turned head of patient care, Olivia had lost her husband to a roadside bombing outside Fallujah 17 years ago. She never remarried. She never left the field. The moment she stepped into room 12B, the atmosphere shifted. Not from tension, but reverence. The dog stilled. Max gave a single subtle tilt of his head. Acknowledgement. Olivia returned the nod. "Morning, gentlemen," she said to the trio, then walked to Jacob's bedside with a practiced grace. She adjusted the monitor settings quietly and made notes on a clipboard, then paused. Her eyes moved to the floor where a silver pen had rolled beneath the bed. Without missing a beat, Shadow ducked under, grabbed it with delicate precision between his teeth, and placed it at her feet. Olivia blinked, then smiled faintly, not from amusement, but appreciation. "You're the quiet one, aren't you?" she murmured to Shadow, always watching. She turned to Jacob and reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a Ziploc bag. Inside were 3 peanut butter dog biscuits, homemade. She knelt carefully and distributed one to each dog. Bruno accepted his with a gentle chomp. Shadow sniffed cautiously before taking his. Max, ever the sentinel, didn't move until she placed the treat near Jacob's hand. Only then did he eat, chewing slowly, eyes never leaving Jacob's face. Jacob stirred. A twitch in his eyelids, a flicker in the corner of his mouth. "Jacob?" Olivia asked softly, setting her clipboard aside and crouching beside the bed. "If you can hear me, squeeze your hand." Nothing. Then, a faint pressure. His fingers tightened ever so slightly around the therapy ball Bruno had nudged into place. "Well done," Olivia whispered, her voice a mixture of relief and restraint. She didn't cry easily anymore. Max gave a quiet whine. Olivia looked at him. "You helped him do that, didn't you?" Jacob's voice broke the moment. It came as a dry whisper, strained and barely audible. "Am I a bad owner?" The question floated in the air like a ghost. Olivia rose, walked to the side of the bed, and sat gently on the edge. She met his eyes, barely focused, rimmed with exhaustion. "No," she said, "you're only bad if you leave, and you haven't." There was a pause. Max rested his head beside Jacob's arm, exhaling slowly. "Even broken," Olivia added, "you're still their pack, and that's enough." Jacob didn't answer, but something in his expression loosened, as though a knot buried deep inside had shifted. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of another figure, a new nurse named April Chase, 28, fresh-faced, with curly chestnut hair pulled into a messy ponytail and freckles scattered across her nose. April was kind-hearted, but sometimes too eager to please. She carried a tray with morning meds and a thermos of warm broth. "Morning," she said, stepping lightly into the room. Olivia glanced at her but didn't speak. April wasn't Olivia's favorite. The young nurse had a habit of asking too many personal questions and trusting too quickly. April approached the bed. "I thought maybe Mr. Hayes might be ready for some broth today." Before Olivia could respond, Bruno stood in front of the tray, not growling, but clearly blocking access. April froze. "He's protective," Olivia said evenly. "Let me—" She took the tray herself and stepped forward. Bruno moved aside immediately. "Respect," she murmured. "Earn it." April blushed and stepped back, watching as Olivia helped Jacob sit slightly upright, offering him a spoonful of warm liquid. Max remained pressed against his side. When Jacob's hand trembled, Max leaned closer, bracing his shoulder like a post. April observed from the corner, a little shaken but thoughtful. Olivia caught her glance and said, "You're welcome to stay." But quietly. "Watch them. Learn how they work." April nodded, now understanding the sacredness of this room. It wasn't just another hospital bed. It was a battlefield of a different kind. That afternoon, as rain began to fall in soft diagonal streaks against the glass, Olivia returned with a blanket. Jacob had drifted to sleep, propped against the incline of the bed. Max lay across his feet. Bruno rested beneath the window. Shadow curled beneath the sink. She covered Jacob carefully, then bent down and whispered to Max, "You're the one keeping him here, aren't you?" Max didn't respond, but as Olivia turned to leave, she saw his tail give a soft, deliberate wag. Riverside Haven had a way of making secrets feel heavier in the cold. The rain from the previous day had hardened into a sheet of gray fog that now clung to the hills like smoke from a slow-burning fire. At the VA Rehabilitation Center, the hallways were quieter than usual, and the air held a tension that no one could quite place. The hum of fluorescent lights echoed louder, and every step down the sterile linoleum floor felt deliberate, measured, like the breath before a verdict. Inside room 12B, the morning had begun almost like the last. Olivia had completed her rounds, offering Jacob a brief but warm nod before disappearing down the hall. Jacob now sat more upright than the day before, propped with 2 pillows, his movements slightly steadier. His right hand trembled less, and he had managed a few words to April earlier, though not enough to qualify as conversation. He stared blankly at the wall, a quiet storm in his mind. Max lay by the foot of the bed, eyes alert. Bruno was stretched across the floor like a fur-covered sentry, and Shadow paced methodically along the wall, pausing at the door every few minutes. The dogs had sensed something before the humans ever did, and something was indeed coming. Across town, in a high-rise office built more from ego than function, sat Trent Wallace, 44, athletic, and sharply dressed in dark tailored suits that clung to him like armor. Trent was the kind of man who believed in systems he could manipulate. He had been head of HR at a regional wellness corporation and knew his way around back channels and private records. His hair, thick and silver-streaked, gave him a falsely noble air. His smile rarely reached his eyes, and when it did, it was never for long. He sat behind a glass desk that overlooked the city skyline, typing one-handed on his phone, the other swirling black coffee in a matte ceramic mug. On the screen was a secure hospital portal. He had already logged in using April Chase's credentials, borrowed without her full understanding, but with her consent, albeit clouded by charm and vague explanations. She had thought she was printing forms. He had accessed something far more valuable. Jacob Hayes' full psychological and neurological report loaded silently onto his device. He scanned quickly, eyes narrowing. Mild cognitive disorientation, recurring combat-induced hallucinations, reactive dissociation, he read aloud, tapping his index finger against the screen. Perfect. A knock on his office door didn't startle him. He closed the tab without urgency and replied, "Come in." Lauren stepped inside. She looked different than she had at the hospital. Here, in Trent's space, she wore muted elegance, navy blouse, slim black slacks, and pearl earrings that barely glinted under the ceiling lights. Her makeup was light, but her lips were pursed tighter than usual. "You said you had something to show me?" she asked, folding her arms. Trent gave her that rehearsed half-smile. "Just a way to protect what's best for you. And for the dogs." Lauren hesitated. "He's still their handler. I'm not even sure he'd let them go." Trent leaned back. "He won't have a say after the hearing." Her eyes flicked downward. Trent stood and handed her a printed document, a draft petition for emergency custody transfer of the 3 canines. The reason listed in bold: medical instability and mental health risks to animals under care. Lauren's expression wavered, but she took the folder. Back at the rehab center, the morning continued in silence. That was, until Nurse Valerie, a woman in her late 30s with dark curly hair pulled into a braided crown, entered the room with an envelope in hand. Valerie had worked in hospice care before transferring here. She spoke rarely, but her eyes always told the truth. She stood at the doorway now, holding the envelope with both hands. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly, "this was delivered for you." Jacob looked up slowly. Max rose before Jacob could move, stepping between him and Valerie with practiced precision. Bruno followed, tail low, head forward. Shadow was already standing by the door, gaze locked onto the hallway. "It's all right," Valerie said gently. "Just a legal notice." Jacob nodded faintly, and Valerie placed the envelope on the bedside table and retreated. Jacob reached for the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. He opened it slowly. His eyes scanned the contents, and his face paled. Emergency petition for the reassignment of ownership of therapeutic canines. He read the name, filed by Miss Lauren Mitchell, supported by co-petitioner Mr. Trent Wallace. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. "They want to take you," he said aloud, not to the room, but to Max. Max tilted his head. Bruno let out a low, guttural rumble, not quite a growl, but enough to shake the tension in the air. Shadow began walking in slow circles around the bed, pausing at each corner, as if establishing a perimeter. Jacob slumped back into the pillows, but his jaw clenched. His mind, once a fog, now stirred like a battlefield rekindled. He didn't have much, but he had them, and they had him. He looked down at Max, who had returned to sit beside the bed, eyes fixed on his face. Jacob reached out, his fingers weaving through the thick fur at Max's neck. "We're not going to let anyone split us up," he whispered. Max blinked once, slowly. Jacob tightened his grip just slightly. Max didn't pull away. The German Shepherd lifted his head, turned toward the door, and stared. And for the first time since the war, Jacob Hayes felt less like a patient and more like a leader again. The morning of the hearing came wrapped in the stillness of late autumn fog. Riverside Haven's streets were blanketed in a pale gray mist. softening the hard lines of buildings and telephone poles, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Outside the Knox County Courthouse, the steps glistened with dew, and a row of vehicles idled along the curb, headlights aglow. From one of them emerged a man dressed in charcoal slacks and a cream shirt, his left hand gripping a worn wooden cane. His posture was upright but strained. It was Jacob Hayes. At his side walked 3 dogs, Max, Bruno, and Shadow, unleashed yet tethered to him by something deeper than leather or chain. Max moved first, a few inches ahead of Jacob, ears forward, steps calculated. Bruno, the Rottweiler, took the opposite flank, steady and grounded. Shadow, the Doberman, danced on alert between rear and front, his pace restless. They passed through the security checkpoint without incident. The guards knew who they were by now. Everyone did. Inside the courtroom, a polished oak floor reflected the harsh overhead lighting. The benches were mostly empty, save for a few reporters, 2 representatives from the county's animal welfare unit, and a clerk at the far end of the room. A bailiff, a man in his early 50s named Curtis Myers, with a round face and kind eyes, stood near the front, occasionally tapping his clipboard as he waited. Judge Lenora Delaney was presiding. She was a woman of few words, early 60s, tall, wiry, with salt and pepper hair cropped short. Her sharp blue eyes could dissect a lie in a heartbeat. She'd spent years on the juvenile bench before moving to civil court, where she quickly earned a reputation for firm but thoughtful rulings. Today, she sat high above the rest, glancing through a thick manila folder marked Hayes, Jacob, Petition for Custodial Reassessment. Jacob was escorted to the defense table. Olivia Monroe accompanied him, not as a nurse this time, but as a silent witness, holding a sealed folder in her hands. April Chase was not present. Jacob sat carefully, exhaling as he adjusted his legs. Max immediately lay at his feet, pressing against his boots like a shadow cast in flesh. Bruno positioned himself near the table's edge, chin resting across Jacob's shoe. Shadow settled a pace behind them, glancing at every movement in the room, ears twitching with each creak of the wood. Then the double doors swung open again, and Lauren entered. She wore a fitted slate-gray dress and carried a brown leather handbag pressed tightly against her side. Her expression was controlled, almost vacant. At her right side walked Trent Wallace, dressed in a navy suit with a faint lavender tie. He wore the confidence of someone who expected to win. They sat down without speaking. Jacob's attorney, Martin Greaves, a silver-haired man with square glasses and a subtle southern accent, stood up to begin. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "we dispute the grounds of the petitioner's claim that Mr. Hayes is incapable of safely caring for the 3 canines in question. He is under ongoing medical supervision, has shown compliance with therapy, and above all," he paused, motioning subtly toward the dogs, "he is the only known human these animals trust." Judge Delaney did not respond. She turned her eyes to the petitioner's side. Rachel Jennings, a thin, severe-looking woman in her late 40s, served as Lauren's counsel. She stood and spoke with a tone devoid of emotion. "We will submit into evidence footage taken from within the VA facility. The footage clearly demonstrates Mr. Hayes experiencing a dissociative episode that could pose harm to animals under his care." With a nod, a technician rolled a monitor to the front of the courtroom and began to play a muted video clip. It showed Jacob in his hospital room, pacing erratically, his hands clenched, his face distorted with panic. At one point, he slammed both palms against the wall and collapsed to the floor, hyperventilating. A murmur swept through the room. Lauren looked down, dabbing the corner of her eye with a tissue. Trent placed a comforting hand on her knee. Jacob said nothing. But Max shifted. His ears flattened slightly, and he pressed closer to Jacob's leg. After a moment, Judge Delaney said, "Defense?" Attorney Greaves stepped forward. "This video documents a moment of acute post-traumatic stress, Your Honor. Not instability, but injury. These canines are trained to assist in precisely such moments. They are not endangered. They are protectors." The judge said nothing. Then Jacob slowly stood. His hands gripped the cane, his breath shaky. He looked straight ahead, not at the bench, not at Lauren, not even at his lawyer, but at Max. "When I came home," Jacob said, his voice rough but even, "I didn't recognize my own name sometimes. I'd wake up thinking I was still on patrol. I couldn't remember where I left my shoes or what day it was. But I never—" His throat caught, then steadied. I never forgot them. He gestured down toward the dogs. They're not just animals. They're the reason I get out of bed. The reason I still breathe when the nightmares don't stop. The reason I'm still here. There was silence. Max's ears flicked forward. Then he licked Jacob's hand. A sound escaped from one of the benches, a stifled exhale from a reporter. Even the clerk stopped writing. Judge Delaney tapped her pen once. This court acknowledges the evidence presented, but also recognizes the unique therapeutic role these animals serve. Until further proceedings and a complete evaluation, custody will not be reassigned. A sharp rap of the gavel. Hearing adjourned. As the room slowly emptied, Jacob leaned forward and murmured to Max, "We've still got more fights ahead." Max responded not with a bark, but by sitting taller, ears high, eyes locked on the path ahead. They would not leave alone. That night, Riverside Haven was drenched in darkness. The fog that had clung to the hills earlier in the day had thickened into a low-hanging veil, swallowing street lamps whole and rendering the hospital parking lot into a shadowy ocean of silhouettes. Inside the VA Rehabilitation Center, Room 12B remained dimly lit by a single reading lamp, its warm yellow glow barely touching the edges of the room. Olivia Monroe had left a thermos of chamomile tea on the bedside table, and a folded blanket sat at the foot of the bed, a silent offering of care. Jacob Hayes was asleep, or something close to it. His body lay still beneath a thin sheet, arms relaxed by his sides, but his face was furrowed, as if his mind refused to rest. Sweat gathered near his hairline, glistening in the pale light. Max lay curled on the floor beside the bed, his head resting on his front paws, eyes open and fixed on Jacob. Shadow was coiled tightly near the foot of the bed, legs tucked in, chest rising and falling with a predator's rhythm. Bruno, ever the bulwark, had stationed himself in front of the door, his massive frame blocking the threshold like a gate made of muscle and intent. At 3:12 a.m., Jacob stirred. It began with a tremble in his hand, then a sharp inhale that sliced through the quiet. He mumbled something incomprehensible, his voice rasping like gravel in the wind. Then came the panic. Sudden, fierce, uninvited. His body jerked upright, eyes wide, chest heaving. The sheet tangled around his legs as he tried to rise, disoriented. No, get down. Where's the line? Max, where's the light?" His words fractured into guttural shouts. Max was up in an instant. In one swift motion, he leapt onto the bed and pressed his body firmly against Jacob's side. His weight wasn't aggressive, it was grounding. Shadow moved next, slipping beneath the hanging edge of the blanket, resting his body just behind Jacob's legs. Bruno didn't move from his post at the door, but he lifted his head, ears perked, letting out a low, reassuring rumble that reverberated through the room like the echo of an oath. Jacob's breathing slowed. He reached out blindly, his hand falling across Max's back. His fingers tightened in the fur, as if clinging to the present, to something real. "I'm here," he muttered, his voice cracked, barely audible. Max didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence alone did what no medicine ever had. The rest of the night passed without incident, though none of the dogs slept again. They stood vigil, not out of command, but instinct. Loyalty wasn't taught in their training, it was bred into their bones. By morning, the fog had lifted slightly, and the early rays of sunlight filtered through the windows in fractured beams. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, chamomile, and damp fur. Jacob sat upright, sipping from a cup of lukewarm tea that April had brought earlier. He looked tired but clearer, like a man who had swum through something deep and surfaced just enough to see the shoreline. When Olivia Monroe entered, clipboard in hand, she paused in the doorway, taking in the sight. Jacob with a blanket around his shoulders, Max seated beside the bed, his body leaning subtly against his handler's thigh. Bruno had stretched out in front of the door again, his eyes alert despite the apparent calm. Shadow, ever restless, was staring out the window, his ears twitching at the chirp of a distant bird. "Rough night?" Olivia asked, her voice low and even. Jacob nodded. "I think I went back to Basra again." She didn't ask for details. She never did. Instead, she walked to the end of the bed and bent down to pick up something near the baseboard. A folded sheet of paper, slightly wrinkled. She held it up. "This yours?" Jacob looked surprised. "Yeah, I think that's what I was writing before the hearing." He reached for it, But before he could, Max stood and gently took the paper between his teeth, walked the short distance to Olivia, and placed it in her hand. Olivia blinked. "You retrieved it for him?" she asked Max directly, more amused than shocked. Max sat. Jacob gave a hoarse laugh. "He doesn't miss a thing." Olivia unfolded the paper and scanned the first few lines. It wasn't eloquent, handwriting uneven, some words misspelled, a few scratched out, but the meaning was pure. It was a speech Jacob had tried to write for court, a message about what the dogs meant to him, about why he couldn't lose them, about survival. She looked back at Max, who was now staring at her, unmoving. "You're not just muscle, are you?" she whispered. "You're something older than training." Max tilted his head slightly. Olivia stepped forward and crouched beside him, her face close to his. She reached up and placed a hand gently behind his ear. "You'll speak, won't you?" she said quietly. "Not with words, but with the weight of presence, the way wolves do." Max blinked once, then, from deep in his chest, came a sound. Not a bark, not a growl, but a short, low vocalization, a single resonant note that echoed through the quiet room like a statement. Olivia didn't smile, she simply nodded. Then it's time they listened. The second hearing took place on a cold Friday morning. The wind in Riverside Haven cut low and sharp, rustling dead leaves across the courthouse steps like scattered whispers. Pigeons hunched near the drain pipes. The city felt older that day, not from time, but from weight. Inside the Knox County Courthouse, the courtroom was busier than before. The gallery wasn't packed, but it had drawn more than the usual handful of staff and reporters. A few veterans had quietly taken seats in the back, wearing plain jackets but stiff postures that told of years in uniform. They didn't speak. They were here for something unspoken, something they recognized in the way Jacob Hayes walked. Jacob entered slowly, his cane steady, his jaw tight. He wore the same pale shirt as before, tucked into dark slacks that hung slightly loose. Behind him moved Max, taller and broader than any dog in the room, with the kind of poise that turned heads. His fur was freshly brushed, and his collar, though old, had been cleaned with care. Just behind him came Bruno, calm and deliberate, and last was Shadow, alert as always, eyes darting across the faces in the gallery like searchlights. Judge Lenora Delaney sat already at her bench, reviewing documents with narrowed eyes. She wore a black robe like armor, and didn't look up as the defense took their place. Olivia Monroe stepped into the witness area, holding a sealed envelope marked Medical and Behavioral Review, Jacob Hayes. She looked composed, but worn. The kind of tired that came not from lack of sleep, but from carrying the weight of people who couldn't carry themselves. Martin Greaves, Jacob's attorney, stood first. "Your Honor," he began, his tone respectful but firm, "we submit a full evaluation from the VA Medical Board stating that Mr. Hayes' condition has shown sustained improvement. His ability to care for his assigned canines is not only intact, it's necessary for his treatment." Judge Delaney nodded once, gesturing for Olivia to approach. The head nurse walked with quiet authority, placing the envelope in the clerk's hands. Her eyes, for a brief moment, met Jacob's. She gave him the smallest of nods. He nodded back. From the other side of the courtroom, Rachel Jennings, attorney for Lauren, stood. "Your Honor, we acknowledge the submitted evaluation, but we would also like to introduce new findings regarding potential misconduct, specifically unauthorized access to Mr. Hayes' medical files." Judge Delaney's expression darkened slightly. "Explain." Rachel signaled to a young paralegal in the back row. He handed over a printed document detailing an internal access log. "This shows that Mr. Hayes' confidential records were viewed and downloaded by someone not employed by the VA. That person is Mr. Trent Wallace." The courtroom stirred. Several heads turned toward Trent, who sat behind Lauren in the gallery, legs crossed, phone untouched in his lap. He wore a sharp suit, but the color had drained from his knuckles. "Are there grounds for a criminal complaint?" the judge asked. Martin Greaves rose again. "We've filed a motion with the district attorney. Meanwhile, we ask that this court acknowledge the potential manipulation of legal evidence." Delaney folded her hands. "Acknowledged. But we'll address the custody issue first." She looked to Jacob. "Mr. Hayes, would you like to speak?" Jacob stood slowly, leaning on his cane. Max moved forward with him and sat, eyes locked on the judge. I used to lead squads through streets with no names, Jacob began, voice husky but controlled. I made calls that I still carry. I came back less than whole. I don't deny that. He paused. But I never left my team behind. Not overseas, not here. He looked down at the dogs. These 3 didn't leave me, even when I didn't know who I was. They watched me when no one else did. They pulled me back when my mind tried to disappear. I didn't train them to do that. They just knew. There was no shaking in his voice now. They're not my pets. They're my pack, and I'm still their leader. He sat. Silence followed. Not out of obligation, but respect. Then Judge Delaney looked to Olivia. Anything further? Olivia, still standing in the back, answered calmly. Mr. Hayes shows consistent responsibility, emotional regulation, and therapeutic engagement. His relationship with these animals is stabilizing, not dangerous. The judge nodded and began flipping through the file. Outside, the air was turning colder again. An hour later, as the crowd spilled into the hallway, Trent Wallace made his move. He approached with a smirk hidden beneath a mask of charm, hands tucked into his coat pockets, walking with the smooth, unhurried gait of a man who had always believed the world would adjust to him. He was halfway across the marble floor when Max stepped forward. No bark, no lunge, just a sudden, unwavering movement, one paw planted squarely in front of Jacob, the other following. His entire body lowered into a stance that said everything. Bruno followed behind him, stiff and low, and Shadow flanked to the other side, head slightly down, teeth just barely visible. Trent stopped. His smirk faded. Max didn't growl, not at first. He simply stared, head tilted slightly, ears forward, eyes locked on Trent's like a judge weighing truth. And then, just once, a deep, steady growl rolled up from his chest, low and long. Trent stepped back. He lifted his hands, said nothing, and turned away. Jacob looked down at Max, then crouched slowly, ignoring the ache in his knees, and placed a hand on the dog's neck. "Good boy," he said. Max didn't wag his tail. He didn't need to. He had already spoken. The first real snow of the season had begun to fall over Riverside Haven. Not heavy, not yet, but enough to paint the sky a soft, uncommitted gray, and leave thin traces of white along the eaves of the VA Rehabilitation Center. The streets outside glistened with a quiet frost, and even the squirrels had stopped chattering, hiding somewhere warmer. Inside room 12B, the air was unusually still. Jacob Hayes sat beside the window in a padded chair, draped in a navy blanket that April had brought earlier that morning. He looked older today, not in years, but in the way a man wears experience. His cane rested across his lap, and a sketchbook lay open on the table next to him. He wasn't drawing. He was watching the trees. Beside him, Max lay in a relaxed but alert position, tail curled around his paws. His ears twitched occasionally, catching every distant door swing and footstep. Bruno and Shadow had taken places in the room, too. Bruno sprawled across the rug, chewing silently on a rawhide bone, and Shadow sitting upright on the windowsill bench, eyes tracking falling snowflakes. The calm was interrupted by the sound of hesitant footsteps just outside the hallway. Olivia Monroe, walking with her usual measured pace, stopped briefly at the door, reading something on her clipboard. With her was a young nurse, April Chase. April looked like she hadn't slept much. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a lopsided ponytail, and the circles under her eyes seemed darker than usual. She was wringing her fingers around a mug of herbal tea as Olivia spoke to her in hushed tones. Olivia's voice, while gentle, was firm, like the steady wind that reshapes stone. April nodded slowly, her shoulders tight with shame. "I didn't know what he was really doing," she whispered. "He just said it was a form for his lawyer. I let him use the terminal for 5 minutes. Olivia didn't scold her. She didn't need to. Back inside, Jacob was unaware of the conversation outside his room, but he was thinking of something else, something that had been stirring in him since the hearing. Later that afternoon, after a quiet lunch and brief walk down the hallway with physical therapy staff, Jacob asked to go outside for a bit. Olivia helped arrange it. They pushed his chair out to the side courtyard, the one with the small stone bench under a red oak that had lost most of its leaves. The cold air bit at his skin, but he didn't mind. Max walked beside the chair, one pace behind the wheel. They sat alone for a few minutes, Jacob and Max, the wind, and the quiet. Then came footsteps again. This time from the rear entrance. Lauren. She looked different than the courtroom version of herself. No high heels, no makeup, no blazer. She wore a long olive green coat and a knitted scarf that her daughter had made 2 winters ago. Her blonde hair hung loose over her shoulders, and her hands trembled slightly as they held a manila envelope. Her posture was unsure, the way a person walks into a room they once called home and no longer recognize. Max saw her first. He rose from beside Jacob and stepped in front of the bench. He didn't growl, he didn't lunge. He simply stood, still, blocking the path between Lauren and Jacob. Lauren stopped. "I came to talk," she said softly, "not to fight." Max didn't move. Jacob looked over without surprise. He's not here to fight either, but he decides who gets close. She gave a small, shaky nod. Then, "Can I sit over there?" She pointed to the bench across the path. Max remained still. Jacob gave the faintest nod. Only then did Max step aside, slowly returning to sit by Jacob's leg. Lauren sat down. The silence stretched between them like old threads in a torn sweater. "I know what Trent did," she said. "I know how he got your records. April told Olivia. Olivia told me." Jacob didn't look at her. He was watching Max, who was now licking a patch of ice from the concrete, seemingly uninterested in the conversation. "He used me," Lauren continued, her voice almost breaking. "He made it seem like all of this was for me, for my safety, for the dogs. But it wasn't. It was just about control." Jacob exhaled slowly. "You don't have to explain it to me. I know what it feels like to follow the wrong leader." Lauren looked at him then, eyes full of regret. "I'm sorry, Jake. Not just for the court, or the dogs. I'm sorry for leaving you behind when you needed someone to stay." Jacob finally met her eyes. There was no hate in them, no fire, only distance. "My pack already said everything," he said quietly. She glanced at Max, who was watching her now, not with judgment, but with something colder, finality. Lauren's lips trembled. She looked down at her hands, then back up. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to say it." Jacob nodded once. "And you did." She stood. Her movements were slow, as though she was moving through water. She didn't ask for anything more, didn't try to touch him, didn't cry. But as she turned to leave, Max held her gaze, his expression unreadable but absolute. And when she stepped out of the courtyard, it was as though a page had been turned. Not torn, just turned, and the space where she'd once stood no longer belonged to her. Jacob sat back, pulling the blanket tighter around his lap. Max settled beside him again, laying his head across Jacob's shoe. "Good boy," Jacob said under his breath. But Max didn't respond. He didn't need to. The third and final hearing dawned under a sky brushed with gold. Sunlight streamed over the rooftops of Riverside Haven, melting the frost that had clung stubbornly to the corners of windows and the limbs of trees. The courthouse steps, which had seemed so cold and imposing weeks before, now gleamed beneath the soft warmth of a late winter sun. Inside the courthouse, the gallery was more crowded than usual. Local reporters filled the rear benches with notepads ready, while a group of veterans, most in plain clothes, a few in decorated hats, sat together near the aisle in silent solidarity. A therapy dog handler from a nearby K-9 recovery unit had brought her Labrador, who lay quietly beneath her seat. There was no tension today, only the hum of something final, something about to close. Jacob Hayes arrived quietly. He wore a dark wool coat over his buttoned shirt and carried his cane more like a companion than a necessity now. Behind him, as always, came the 3 dogs, Max, Bruno, and Shadow. The air around them shifted when they entered, not because they barked or moved quickly, but because they belonged. Max led with quiet power, ears forward, eyes calm. Bruno followed with that slow, unshakable gait, his thick frame moving like muscle sculpted into motion. Shadow brought up the rear, lean and sharp-eyed, already scanning the faces of the room like a sentinel. They took their usual place beside the defense table. No words were exchanged between the man and his dogs. They simply were. A unit, a bond, a truth. At the opposite side of the room, Lauren entered alone. Her coat was navy, buttoned high against the wind, and she held no documents in her hand. Her face was free of makeup, and her blonde hair, once meticulously styled, now fell loosely over her shoulders. She sat quietly, not at the petitioner's table, but a row behind it. When the judge entered, Lauren stood with the others, but did not speak. Judge Delaney glanced over the courtroom with the measured gaze of someone who had seen too many cases end in regret and too few in resolve. She adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "Before we begin," she said, "the court has received an amended motion from the petitioner." There was a shuffle of papers. The clerk handed over a single-page document. Delaney read it, then looked back toward Lauren. "Miss Mitchell, would you like to confirm this request before the court?" Lauren stood, her voice steady, though not loud. "Yes, Your Honor. I would like to withdraw the petition. I no longer contest Mr. Hayes' custody of the 3 canines." A murmur swept through the gallery. Reporters leaned forward. Delaney nodded. Motion noted. Further, based on evidence reviewed by the district attorney's office, the court confirms that Mr. Trent Wallace accessed and distributed confidential medical records without authorization. He has been permanently barred from working with animals or minors in any capacity. Another hush. A slow-growing sense of closure settled over the room, like snow that falls after the wind has stilled. The gavel came down. "This hearing is concluded." As people began to rise, Jacob turned toward Max. The old German shepherd looked up at him, not wagging, not moving, just waiting. Jacob scratched gently behind his ear and whispered, "We made it." Later that week, the park at the heart of Riverside Haven buzzed with a different kind of energy. It was the first morning of the Haven Canine Recovery and Resilience Program, a modest effort spearheaded by Jacob with the help of the VA, a few volunteers, and, of course, his 3 partners. It wasn't much. A stretch of grassy field, a few benches, and a collection of cones and wooden hurdles, assembled by the maintenance crew. But it meant something. There were 6 dogs enrolled on the first day, all former service animals or rescues with trauma in their past. Some barked too much. Some wouldn't make eye contact. Others trembled at sudden sounds. But they had come, and they were watching. Jacob stood in the center of the field in a fleece-lined jacket and cargo pants. A whistle hung from his neck, though he hadn't used it yet. Max sat to his right, posture tall, gaze steady. To the left, Bruno was already rolling a tire-like rubber ball toward a pit marked strength training. Shadow darted between cones like a blur, weaving without command. A young woman named Tanya, no older than 20, watched nervously as her pit lab mix cowered behind her legs. She was slim and pale, with oversized glasses and a sweater that hung off one shoulder. She'd lost her brother to PTSD 2 years ago, and this dog was all she had left. She didn't say much, but Jacob noticed her eyes never left Max. "Is he always that calm?" she asked. Jacob smiled. "Not always, just when it matters most." She nodded, then knelt and gave her dog a scratch. "I hope mine can be like him someday." Jacob looked down at Max, then over at the others gathering around. More handlers, more dogs, the start of something real. He took a step forward, whistle still untouched. "Everyone listen up," he called out. "Today's not about drills or obedience. It's about trust. It's about choosing each other, even when things are messy." He looked over at Max, Bruno, and Shadow. "These 3," he said, "they didn't choose me because I was the strongest or the smartest. They chose me because I stayed, and that's what family is." He paused. Let the words land. Family isn't just blood. It's the ones who stay. The moment hung in the air. Then Max let out a loud single bark, a sound sharp and sure. Bruno followed with a deep, throaty howl that turned heads. Shadow, not to be outdone, raised his muzzle and released a long, clear note that seemed to echo across the entire park. The other dogs began to stir. Some barked, some howled, some just wagged their tails. And the humans, those wounded, healing, stubborn souls, began to clap. Not out of ceremony, out of understanding. Because in that moment, beneath the sun of Riverside Haven, a broken soldier, 3 loyal dogs, and a handful of strangers formed something greater than healing. They formed a pack. Sometimes, the miracle isn't a flash of lightning or a parting sea. Sometimes, it's a German shepherd refusing to leave your side. It's a wounded man learning to stand again. Not because he had the strength, but because his pack believed he could. And perhaps, it's no coincidence. Perhaps God sends his angels not with wings, but with paws, with eyes that never judge, and hearts that never leave. In a world that often forgets the broken, he reminds us, through loyalty, through love, that we are never truly alone. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment Amen if you believe God sends help in the most unexpected forms. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and redemption. And may God bless you and your family always.
When retired veterinarian Dr. Robert Martinez was enjoying his morning coffee on his Nevada ranch, the last thing he expected was to see a magnificent Mustang stallion standing at his fence line, staring directly at him with an intensity that seemed almost human. The horse showed no fear of humans, which was unusual for a wild Mustang. But what happened next would leave Dr. Martinez speechless. As he approached the fence, the stallion began displaying behaviors that suggested not just recognition, but deep emotional memory of their shared past. 5 years earlier, Dr. Martinez had saved this horse's life under circumstances he thought the animal would never remember, but what the stallion did, minutes after their reunion, would prove that some bonds transcend species and time, leading to a discovery that would change everything scientists believed about animal memory, gratitude, and the extraordinary intelligence of America's wild horses. Dr. Robert Martinez had been enjoying his retirement from veterinary practice for 2 years, but he still woke every morning at 5:30 a.m. out of habit from 4 decades of emergency animal calls. His small ranch in the Carson Valley of Nevada was perfect for a quiet retirement, 20 acres of pasture surrounded by a Bureau of Land Management wilderness, where wild Mustang herds roamed freely. On this particular October morning, Dr. Martinez, now 67 years old, with silver hair and the weathered hands of a lifetime spent treating large animals, was sipping his coffee on the front porch when he noticed something unusual. A large, dark bay Mustang stallion was standing motionless at his property's fence line about 50 yards from the house. The horse was magnificent, easily 15 hands tall with the muscular build and intelligent eyes that marked him as a mature stallion in his prime. His coat gleamed in the morning sunlight, and his black mane flowed freely in the gentle breeze. Most striking were the distinctive white markings on his face and legs that created an almost paint-like pattern against his dark coat. What made the situation unusual wasn't just the horse's proximity to human habitation. Wild Mustangs occasionally wandered near ranch properties, but his behavior. Instead of grazing or moving on as wild horses typically did, this stallion was standing perfectly still, facing the house, almost as if he was waiting for something. Dr. Martinez set down his coffee cup and observed the horse through his binoculars. The stallion's posture was alert but not defensive, curious but not fearful. His ears were forward, focused intently on the house, and his dark eyes seemed to be scanning the property with purpose rather than the random awareness typical of grazing animals. "That's odd," Dr. Martinez murmured to himself. In his 40 years of veterinary practice, including extensive work with wild horses, he had never seen a wild stallion display such focused, deliberate behavior toward a human residence. As Dr. Martinez watched, the stallion took several steps closer to the fence, then stopped again, maintaining his fixed gaze toward the house. There was something about the horse's demeanor that seemed almost expectant, as if he was looking for someone specific. Dr. Martinez decided to investigate. He walked slowly toward the fence, moving with the calm, non-threatening approach he had perfected during decades of working with frightened or injured animals. Wild horses typically bolted at the first sign of human approach, especially from an adult male who could be perceived as threatening. But this stallion didn't move. As Dr. Martinez got closer, the horse actually took a step forward, bringing himself right up to the fence line. The two were now separated by only 3 strands of wire, close enough for Dr. Martinez to see every detail of the horse's features. That's when Dr. Martinez noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. On the stallion's left shoulder, barely visible beneath his thick coat, was a faint but distinctive scar, a curved line about 6 inches long that looked exactly like the kind of mark left by barbed wire. Dr. Martinez's mind raced back through years of cases, searching for a memory that seemed to be hovering just at the edge of his consciousness. The horse's markings, his size, that particular scar, they triggered a recollection that was both vivid and impossible. "It can't be," Dr. Martinez whispered, staring into the stallion's intelligent dark eyes. "You can't possibly be." The stallion stepped even closer to the fence, lowering his head slightly in a gesture that seemed almost like a greeting. For a moment, man and horse stood perfectly still, separated by wire but connected by something neither could quite name. Dr. Martinez felt a chill run down his spine as the implications of what he was seeing began to sink in. If his growing suspicion was correct, this magnificent stallion standing at his fence wasn't just any wild horse. He was a living reminder of one of the most challenging and rewarding cases of Dr. Martinez's entire career. As Dr. Martinez stared into the stallion's eyes, the memory came flooding back with startling clarity. 5 years ago, almost to the month, he had received an emergency call that would become one of the most memorable cases of his career. A young Mustang colt had been found by hikers, severely injured and barely alive, caught in an abandoned barbed wire fence deep in the Nevada wilderness. The colt had been trapped for what veterinary examinations suggested was at least 12 hours, struggling against the wire until exhaustion and blood loss had left him too weak to continue fighting. The barbed wire had cut deep into his left shoulder, creating the exact curved scar that Dr. Martinez was now looking at on this magnificent stallion. "Thunder," Dr. Martinez said quietly, and the stallion's ears pricked forward at the sound of the name. "You're Thunder, aren't you?" The horse had earned that name during his recovery because of his powerful, rumbling vocalizations that echoed through Dr. Martinez's veterinary clinic during the 3 weeks of intensive treatment. The young colt had been touch and go for the first week, requiring round-the-clock care, multiple surgeries to repair the muscle damage, and careful monitoring for infection. Dr. Martinez remembered every detail of those challenging weeks. Thunder had been approximately 18 months old when he was injured, old enough to be independent from his mother, but young enough that his survival instincts weren't fully developed. The trauma had left him not just physically injured, but psychologically damaged, requiring patient, gentle handling to rebuild his trust. The most remarkable aspect of Thunder's recovery hadn't been the physical healing. Impressive though it was, but the bond that had developed between the young Mustang and Dr. Martinez. Unlike most wild horses, who remained fearful of humans throughout their treatment, Thunder had seemed to understand that the veterinarian was helping him. Dr. Martinez recalled sitting beside Thunder's stall during those long nights of recovery, talking to the colt in quiet tones while monitoring his vital signs and changing bandages. Thunder would watch him intently, never showing the panic or aggression typical of wild horses in captivity. It was as if the young Mustang understood that his survival depended on accepting human help. The decision to release Thunder back to the wild had been difficult but necessary. As a wild Mustang, Thunder belonged in the wilderness, not in captivity, regardless of how well he had adapted to human care. Dr. Martinez had coordinated with the Bureau of Land Management to return Thunder to his natal range, hoping that the young stallion would be able to reintegrate with wild herds, despite his unusual experience with humans. That had been 5 years ago, and Dr. Martinez had often wondered what had become of the young colt he had saved. Wild horses faced numerous challenges: predators, harsh weather, competition for resources, and the ongoing threat of roundups by federal agencies managing population levels. The survival rate for young stallions was particularly challenging, as they had to establish their own territory and compete with older, more experienced males. Now, looking at this powerful, healthy stallion standing confidently at his fence, Dr. Martinez realized that Thunder had not only survived, but thrived. The young colt who had nearly died in barbed wire had grown into a magnificent example of wild Mustang genetics, strong, intelligent, and clearly successful in the demanding world of wild horse social dynamics. But what amazed Dr. Martinez most was the apparent recognition. Thunder was displaying behavior that suggested he remembered not just the location where he had recovered, but the specific human who had saved his life. Animal memory research suggested that horses could maintain emotional memories for years, but this level of apparent recognition and purposeful behavior exceeded anything Dr. Martinez had seen in scientific literature. As veterinarian and horse continued their silent communication across the fence line, Dr. Martinez began to understand that this reunion was about to become something extraordinary that would challenge everything he thought he knew about animal intelligence and emotional memory. Dr. Martinez moved slowly along the fence line, and Thunder kept pace with him, walking parallel on the other side of the wire. The stallion's movements were fluid and confident, showing none of the skittish energy typical of wild horses near human structures. Instead, Thunder seemed relaxed and purposeful, as if this meeting was exactly what he had intended. "Thunder, is it really you?" Dr. Martinez said softly, stopping about 3 feet from the fence. The stallion immediately stopped as well, turning to face him directly. What happened next sent chills down Dr. Martinez's spine and challenged everything he thought he knew about animal behavior. Thunder lowered his head and extended his muzzle toward Dr. Martinez, exactly as he had done during his recovery 5 years earlier when the veterinarian would check his healing wounds. It was a gesture of trust and recognition that Dr. Martinez had seen Thunder perform hundreds of times during his treatment, but never expected to see again in the wild. Without thinking, Dr. Martinez extended his hand toward the fence. Thunder moved closer, gently touching his nose to Dr. Martinez's palm through the wire, the same greeting they had shared every morning during those 3 weeks of recovery. The contact was brief but unmistakable. This wild stallion was deliberately recreating a behavioral pattern from his youth. "My God," Dr. Martinez whispered, tears forming in his eyes. "You do remember." Thunder's next action was even more extraordinary. The stallion backed away from the fence about 10 feet, then performed a series of movements that Dr. Martinez recognized as the physical therapy exercises they had practiced during recovery. Thunder would walk in small circles, stretch his neck, and lift his legs in specific patterns that Dr. Martinez had taught him to strengthen the muscles damaged by the barbed wire. But Thunder wasn't just demonstrating healed mobility. He was showing Dr. Martinez that the lessons from his recovery had been remembered and preserved throughout 5 years of wild living. The colt who had learned to trust humans during his most vulnerable time had grown into a stallion who maintained that emotional connection despite returning to complete wilderness independence. Dr. Martinez pulled out his cell phone and began recording, knowing that this behavior would be of tremendous interest to animal behaviorists and equine researchers. Thunder seemed completely comfortable with being observed and documented, showing none of the camera shyness typical of wild animals. The most remarkable moment came when Thunder began to vocalize, not the aggressive calls typical of stallions establishing territory, but the soft, rumbling sounds he had made during his recovery when Dr. Martinez would sit beside his stall. The veterinarian had interpreted those sounds as contentment or gratitude during Thunder's healing, and hearing them again in this context suggested that Thunder was expressing similar emotions about their reunion. "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you?" Dr. Martinez said, and Thunder's ears swiveled toward him with obvious attention and intelligence. Thunder then did something that made Dr. Martinez's heart race with anticipation. The stallion moved to a specific section of the fence and began pawing at the ground, then looked directly at Dr. Martinez and back at the fence, repeating this pattern several times. It was clear that Thunder wanted Dr. Martinez to approach that particular spot, but the reason wasn't immediately obvious. As Dr. Martinez walked toward the area Thunder had indicated, he noticed that the fence line there was slightly lower than the rest, and the wire was looser, possibly a section that had been damaged by weather or wildlife and never properly repaired. Thunder's behavior suggested he wanted Dr. Martinez to do something at that location, but what happened next would exceed even Dr. Martinez's wildest expectations about animal intelligence and emotional memory. The stallion was clearly preparing to demonstrate something that would leave the veterinarian speechless and change everything he believed about the bonds that could form between humans and wild animals. As Dr. Martinez approached the section of fence Thunder had indicated, the stallion's behavior became even more purposeful and urgent. Thunder moved to the loose wire section and began gently pushing against it with his chest, demonstrating that the fence could be manipulated at that point. Then he stepped back and looked directly at Dr. Martinez, as if waiting for him to understand the message. "You want me to open the fence?" Dr. Martinez asked, hardly believing what he was interpreting from Thunder's actions. Thunder responded by nodding his head, a gesture that could have been coincidental but seemed remarkably like confirmation. Dr. Martinez had seen horses learn to nod in response to human questions during training, but Thunder was a wild stallion who had spent only 3 weeks in human care 5 years earlier. Against his better judgment about wild animal interactions, Dr. Martinez carefully lifted the loose wire, creating an opening large enough for Thunder to pass through if he chose to. The stallion immediately stepped onto Dr. Martinez's property, but instead of the cautious, alert behavior expected from a wild horse in unfamiliar territory, Thunder moved with confidence and purpose. What happened next left Dr. Martinez completely speechless. Thunder walked directly to Dr. Martinez and gently rested his head against the veterinarian's chest, in exactly the same position they had maintained during those long recovery nights when Dr. Martinez would sit beside his stall providing comfort during painful healing. The physical contact was brief but profound, a deliberate recreation of their most intimate moments of connection from 5 years earlier. But Thunder wasn't finished. He stepped back from Dr. Martinez and moved toward the gate leading to the main ranch area, then stopped and looked back, clearly indicating that Dr. Martinez should follow him. The stallion was leading the veterinarian somewhere specific, with obvious intention and destination in mind. Dr. Martinez followed Thunder toward the back pasture, his mind racing with questions about what could possibly motivate such complex, purposeful behavior from a wild animal. Thunder moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going and what he intended to accomplish. When they reached the main pasture area, Thunder stopped and turned toward the tree line that bordered Dr. Martinez's property. The stallion issued a low, rumbling call, not the sharp whinny typical of horse communication, but a deeper, more complex vocalization that seemed designed to carry across long distances. The response to Thunder's call was immediate and shocking. From the trees emerged a small herd of wild mustangs, 2 mares and 3 young foals, all moving with the cautious but deliberate approach of animals following a trusted leader. Thunder had brought his family to meet Dr. Martinez. Dr. Martinez stood perfectly still, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was witnessing. Thunder hadn't just remembered his savior. He had specifically sought him out and brought the most important members of his life to this reunion. The wild stallion was introducing his family to the human who had saved his life, as if understanding that Dr. Martinez held special significance that needed to be shared. The mares approached cautiously but without fear, clearly trusting Thunder's judgment about this human's safety. The foals, probably Thunder's offspring, showed curiosity rather than the skittish fear typical of young wild horses encountering humans for the first time. Thunder moved between his family and Dr. Martinez, clearly facilitating this introduction with purpose and intelligence that exceeded anything documented in equine behavioral research. The stallion was demonstrating social concepts, gratitude, family introduction, emotional memory, that scientists were only beginning to understand in wild animal populations. As Dr. Martinez watched Thunder interact with his family while maintaining awareness of the human who had saved his life, he realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in animal behavior studies. This wasn't just recognition or memory. It was Thunder's deliberate decision to share the most important elements of his current life with the person who had made that life possible. What would happen during the rest of this extraordinary visit would provide evidence that would revolutionize scientific understanding of animal intelligence, emotional complexity, and the lasting impact of human-animal bonds. As Thunder's family settled into the pasture, Dr. Martinez observed behaviors that challenged everything he thought he knew about wild horse social dynamics and intelligence. Thunder wasn't just visiting. He was conducting what appeared to be a deliberate demonstration of his life achievements, as if reporting back to the veterinarian who had made his survival possible. The two mares, both beautiful examples of Mustang genetics with the hardy build and intelligent eyes characteristic of successful wild horses, remained close to Thunder but showed remarkable tolerance for Dr. Martinez's presence. Wild mares were typically extremely protective of their foals around humans, but these animals seemed to understand that this particular human posed no threat to their family. Thunder's behavior became even more extraordinary as he began what Dr. Martinez could only interpret as presentations of his offspring. The stallion would approach each foal, gently guide them closer to Dr. Martinez, then position himself between them in a protective but non-threatening stance that seemed designed to facilitate observation rather than prevent interaction. "You're showing them to me," Dr. Martinez said in amazement. "You're actually introducing your children." The oldest foal, probably about 6 months old, showed markings remarkably similar to Thunder's, the same distinctive white patterns that had helped Dr. Martinez identify the stallion. But more significantly, this young horse displayed none of the fear responses typical of wild foals around humans. Instead, he approached Dr. Martinez with curiosity and confidence that suggested genetic inheritance of Thunder's unusual comfort with human contact. Dr. Martinez began documenting everything with his phone, knowing that this behavioral evidence would be crucial for animal behaviorists trying to understand the complex social and emotional intelligence Thunder was demonstrating. The implications for wild horse management and conservation were potentially revolutionary. The most remarkable discovery came when Dr. Martinez noticed that one of the younger foals was favoring his left front leg. Years of veterinary experience allowed him to recognize the subtle signs of lameness that might not be obvious to casual observers. Thunder seemed to notice Dr. Martinez's attention to the injured foal and immediately moved to position the young horse where Dr. Martinez could get a better view. "You want me to look at him, don't you?" Dr. Martinez said, hardly believing that Thunder could understand such complex concepts as veterinary evaluation and treatment. Thunder's response was to gently guide the injured foal even closer to Dr. Martinez, then step back in a gesture that seemed like permission for examination. The wild stallion was actually requesting veterinary care for his offspring from the human who had once provided the same care for him. Dr. Martinez moved slowly toward the injured foal, watching for any sign of panic or defensive behavior from the family group. Instead, Thunder maintained a protective but allowing stance that suggested trust in Dr. Martinez's intentions and expertise. The examination revealed a stone bruise on the foal's hoof, painful but easily treatable with proper care. Dr. Martinez was able to remove the embedded stone and apply antiseptic from his ranch first aid supplies, all while Thunder watched intently, and the foal remained remarkably calm for a wild animal receiving human medical treatment. "This is incredible," Dr. Martinez murmured as he completed the treatment. "You're actually using learned behavior to seek veterinary care for your family." But Thunder wasn't finished with his demonstrations. As the afternoon progressed, the stallion continued displaying behaviors that suggested complex understanding of human-animal relationships, veterinary medicine, and even gratitude concepts that researchers were only beginning to document in wild animal populations. Dr. Martinez realized he was witnessing the evolution of animal intelligence in real time. A wild horse who had learned from human contact and was now teaching those lessons to his offspring while maintaining his wild independence. Thunder had become a bridge between wild and domestic animal behavior, demonstrating that intelligence and emotional complexity in horses far exceeded scientific understanding. The implications of this visit would extend far beyond a simple reunion, potentially changing how humans approached wild horse conservation and management across the American West. 2 hours after Thunder's unexpected arrival, Dr. Martinez watched as the magnificent stallion prepared to lead his family back to the wilderness. But this wasn't a simple departure. It was a carefully orchestrated conclusion to what Dr. Martinez now understood had been a purposeful mission to reconnect with his savior and ensure the health of his offspring. Thunder approached Dr. Martinez one final time, once again resting his head briefly against the veterinarian's chest in the same gesture of trust and affection they had shared during his recovery 5 years earlier. This time, however, the contact felt like gratitude and closure rather than need and dependence. "Take care of your family," Dr. Martinez whispered, gently touching Thunder's neck. "And thank you for trusting me with them." Thunder stepped back, issued a soft, rumbling call to his mares and foals, and led them toward the fence opening. But before leaving Dr. Martinez's property, the stallion turned for one last look at the human who had saved his life, as if committing this moment to the same remarkable memory that had brought him here. Dr. Martinez spent the following weeks documenting Thunder's visit and sharing the footage with animal behaviorists, equine researchers, and wild horse conservation organizations. The response was immediate and extraordinary. Thunder's behavior represented some of the most compelling evidence ever recorded of complex emotional intelligence, long-term memory, and problem-solving capabilities in wild horses. Dr. Sarah Chen, an animal behaviorist from UC Davis, traveled to Nevada to interview Dr. Martinez and analyze the video documentation. "What Thunder demonstrated goes far beyond simple recognition," Dr. Chen explained. "He showed intentional behavior, family introduction, medical care seeking, and gratitude expression that we're only beginning to understand in wild animal populations." The Bureau of Land Management incorporated Thunder's case into their wild horse management protocols, recognizing that some animals might possess intelligence and emotional complexity that required different approaches to population control and habitat management. Thunder's herd was designated for special protection status, ensuring that his unique genetic and behavioral traits would be preserved for future research. Dr. Martinez came out of retirement to establish the Thunder Research Foundation, dedicated to studying human-animal bonds and their impact on wild horse conservation. The foundation's work attracted funding from universities and conservation organizations worldwide, making Nevada a center for advanced equine intelligence research. The injured foal made a complete recovery and was observed 6 months later displaying the same confident, intelligent behavior around humans that characterized his father. Thunder was apparently teaching his offspring that humans could be trusted sources of help rather than threats to be avoided. Thunder's story attracted international attention from conservation biologists studying animal intelligence and emotional complexity. His case became required study material in veterinary schools and animal behavior programs, inspiring a new generation of researchers to investigate the sophisticated cognitive abilities of wild animals. Most remarkably, Thunder continued to visit Dr. Martinez's ranch annually, each time bringing his growing family and demonstrating new examples of learned behavior and problem solving that expanded scientific understanding of equine intelligence. These visits became documented research opportunities that contributed to breakthrough discoveries about animal memory, social learning, and cross-species communication. Dr. Martinez often reflected on how saving one injured colt had led to discoveries that benefited wild horse conservation worldwide. Thunder's survival had become a catalyst for understanding that wild animals possessed emotional and intellectual capabilities far more sophisticated than previously recognized. If Thunder's incredible story of recognition, gratitude, and family bonds inspired you, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more amazing true stories of animal intelligence and human-wildlife connections. Share this video with someone who believes in the extraordinary emotional lives of wild animals, because Thunder's story proves that the bonds formed through compassion and care